The moment you learn about biases, you start seeing them everywhere. That shift from naive to skeptical just made you worse at thinking, not better. It feels like progress. You read about cognitive biases, you learn how the brain tricks itself. Suddenly you're aware. You catch yourself falling for things. You question your assumptions. You don't trust your first reaction. This should make you smarter. But watch what happens. Someone shares research. You immediately think, what's the bias here? A friend makes a claim. You assume they're being influenced by something. You read an article, you pick it apart for logical fallacies before considering if it's true. You've become so good at spotting bias that you reject everything, including things that are actually correct. You're not thinking critically anymore. You're thinking cynically. And cynicism, dressed up as skepticism, is just another way to be wrong. This is called overgeneralized skepticism, the tendency to dismiss valid information because you've learned to be suspicious of everything. Studies show that people who learn about cognitive biases often become worse at evaluating arguments, not better. Your brain learned that bias exists everywhere, so it started treating everything as potentially biased. This comes from a good place. You don't want to be fooled. You want to think clearly. But your brain took the lesson too far. It went from recognizing bias exists to assuming bias invalidates everything. The problem is bias and truth aren't opposites. Something can be biased and still be correct. But your skepticism doesn't make that distinction. Your brain thinks it's being rigorous and careful. It's actually using skepticism as an excuse to reject anything that challenges what you already believe. Look at what happens when you're evaluating new information. You see a study. Before reading it, you think, who funded this? Your brain has already framed it as suspicious. You read it looking for problems. You find one small limitation. You dismiss the entire study. But every study has limitations. Your skepticism just gave you permission to ignore evidence. Or someone makes an argument you don't like. You immediately think they're falling for confirmation bias. You don't engage with their actual point. You've labeled them as biased and moved on. But you're also biased. You're using their bias as a shield against changing your mind. Or you're considering a decision. You think through all the ways your brain might be tricking you. Analysis paralysis sets in. You can't decide because every option feels like it could be a cognitive trap. Your awareness of bias has made you unable to act on anything. And here's what nobody tells you about this. The more you know about biases, the better you get at spotting them in others while staying blind to your own. You see their motivated reasoning. You miss yours. You catch their confirmation bias. You ignore yours. Your knowledge of bias became a weapon to dismiss what you don't want to hear instead of a tool to think better. The skepticism feels like intellectual honesty. It's actually intellectual paralysis disguised as rigor. You question everything you read. This makes you feel smart and careful, which reinforces that skepticism equals intelligence, which makes you question even more, which means you never actually update your beliefs because everything fails your impossibly high standard of proof. You're not just being overly skeptical about one thing. You're building a thinking style where nothing is ever good enough to change your mind. The bias awareness that should have opened your mind is keeping it closed. This isn't your imagination. The research backs this up. Most people think this is about having higher standards, so they become even more skeptical. They demand perfect evidence. They poke holes in everything. But that's like refusing to eat because all food has some level of bacteria. The real issue isn't that you're being too careful. It's that you're applying skepticism uniformly when it should be applied strategically. Not everything deserves the same level of doubt, but your brain treats a peer-reviewed study and a random tweet with equal suspicion because both could theoretically involve bias. This bias survives because skepticism feels smarter than belief. Doubting something makes you seem rational. Accepting something makes you seem naive. Plus, admitting you were wrong about being overly skeptical feels like admitting you were fooled by your own intelligence. That's harder to face than just staying skeptical. And if you lowered your skepticism, you might have to change your mind about things. You might have to admit you rejected true things because you were too busy looking for flaws. Your brain would rather maintain impossible standards than risk being wrong about being right to doubt everything. And that's exactly why most advice about this fails. People who think clearly don't have less skepticism. They have calibrated skepticism. You apply maximum doubt to everything. They ask, does this deserve doubt? Or am I just being defensive? You look for reasons to reject. They look for reasons it might be true before looking for reasons it might be false. The difference isn't how much they question. It's knowing when questioning is useful, and when it's just a defense mechanism. You're using skepticism to protect your existing beliefs. They're using skepticism to refine them, and that's the whole point of knowing about bias in the first place. So the next time you learn something new and your first instinct is to pick it apart and find the flaw, you'll know what's really happening. Your bias awareness is making you overly suspicious. You're treating everything like it needs to be proven beyond all doubt before you'll consider it. But that standard doesn't exist in real thinking. Every source has some bias. Every study has limitations. Every argument has gaps. Now you can catch it. You can feel the automatic skepticism rising and ask, is this thing actually flawed? Or am I just uncomfortable with it? You're not trying to be less critical. You're just recognizing that being critical of everything is the same as being critical of nothing. You started this video thinking, learning about biases made you smarter. Now, you know, it might have just made you better at rejecting things. That's not a small shift. That's realizing skepticism without judgment is just cynicism with extra steps. You now know something most people will never figure out. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. Click the video on screen to discover why smart people make the dumbest mistakes.